Hi everyone, thank you for joining me. I'm Corine Mulet, I'm a Technical Project Manager at NABERS, and I'm here to talk to you about what the future of NABERS Energy looks like. The future of NABERS Energy is a project that we've been working on for the past year, and there's a number of kind of key things that we've been doing as part of this project. As you know, NABERS is a benchmarking system that has existed for over 20 years, and it's always supported the property industry to measure and improve energy efficiency, to take up renewable energy, and for the past couple of years we've also had recognition for carbon neutral buildings. Now there's been a number of shifts and transformations that have happened in the property and in the energy markets, and today we're going to be talking about how NABERS is going to look to remain really relevant and to evolve so that we can continue to support the property industry in their own changing objectives. This is a 45-minute session, and so I will be presenting the future of NABERS Energy, but we will have a couple of Q&A sessions during the presentation. I'll be joined by Carlos Flores, the NABERS Program Director, and so if you have any questions that you'd like to ask, then you can click on the right-hand side, the right-hand corner of your screen on the blue hand icon, and you can pop those questions into a chat. So in terms of what I'll be talking to you about today, we're going to start with some background, and then I'll be taking you through two of the key updates that we're going to be making to the NABERS Energy rating tools. And at the end, I'll be taking you through some of the other things that we've been working on as part of the Future of NABERS Energy project, and I will be taking you through these things that are kind of still a work in progress. So let's start with the background. So this is going to be some background about how the NABERS Energy rating tools work and also what the Future of NABERS Energy project is all about. So as you will know, NABERS Energy is a rating system that looks at the energy efficiency of a building. So you can get a NABERS Energy rating. It's on a 0 to 6-star scale, and it looks at the operational performance of the building. A building owner can also get a NABERS Energy with green power rating, and that's where they're essentially going to be buying green power to improve their NABERS Energy rating. So they could get a 4-star NABERS Energy rating, for example, and then by purchasing green power, they can get a better NABERS Energy with green power result. Like I said earlier, 2 years ago, NABERS started to recognize carbon neutral buildings. We do that through the Climate Active Carbon Neutral certification. Climate Active is a Commonwealth government run program that offers carbon neutral certification for many different types of things. For example, precincts for services, for products. And 2 years ago, Climate Active also released a pathway for buildings. What exactly does carbon neutrality mean? To get a Climate Active Carbon Neutral certification through NABERS, you have to get a NABERS Energy rating, and then we also look at the other emissions, the operational emissions from the building. The key emissions that we look at are obviously the energy emissions from that NABERS Energy rating, but also the water emissions from the water consumption, the emissions linked to the waste generation, and the emissions linked to the leakage of refrigerants, the refrigerants that you can find in the cooling and in HVAC systems. And once that once the inventory of the emissions is made, the building owner will buy carbon offsets to cancel the emissions from all of the operations of the building to obtain carbon neutral certification. So what you can see is that currently we have a bit of a stepped approach where you can get your NABERS Energy rating, which really looks at the performance, the operational performance of the building. You can purchase renewable energy and get an improved NABERS Energy with green power rating, and then you can go that step further to look at the other emissions that are in the building and get carbon neutral certification. Now, as part of the Future of NABERS Energy project that we started 12 months ago, we've been looking at how NABERS Energy should be evolving and adapting to stay in line with the changes that are happening in the property and the energy markets. The key changes that we've been looking at are things like, so the first is that we've been looking at how renewable energy has been increasing in Australia, and this has caused the electricity grid to decarbonise. The second thing we've been looking at is the increase in net zero targets. We've seen really a strong increase in net zero targets in state governments and also in a lot of property groups. We've seen that how renewable energy purchasing is happening has changed over the past few years with the increasing power purchase agreements, the PPAs. And finally, we've also been looking at how carbon accounting methods have been evolving in the past few years. This project has been a lot of collaboration and consultation with a number of organizations and individuals. So we started the project by essentially setting up a technical working group, and especially for the future of NABERS Energy. And this technical working group has been a place for us to gain a lot of insight on how the markets are changing, how the property industry's objectives are evolving, and also get a lot of ideas from building owners on how things could be changing, and also providing a lot of feedback on the different options and proposals that we've been putting forward. Through that process, we created a public consultation paper, which we released in May, essentially to get as much feedback as we can on these different proposals that we're making. And finally, we've also been working with our NABERS National Steering Committee, which is essentially the committee that provides all of the strategic decisions and approvals for NABERS. And the National Steering Committee is made up of the Commonwealth Government and each state government, and also some peak bodies which have a close connection to NABERS. So after all of this work and consultation and collaboration, we had a lot of support for some specific changes that we proposed. And so we're here today to basically announce these changes that we'll be making to NABERS Energy rating tools next year. So here are the two changes that we'll be making. The first is that we will be updating the emissions factors that are used in NABERS Energy ratings, and that is for NABERS to start reflecting the decarbonisation of the grid that is actually happening. The second change that we'll be making in July 2021 is that NABERS Energy with Green Power will align with the International Carbon Accounting Protocol. I'm going to dive into these two updates in detail, and then at the end I'll also take you through what we're still working on as part of the project, things that are still in consideration. And these are mainly linked to net zero. So let's start on the first update, which is updating the emissions factors. This section is a little bit content heavy. There's a lot to digest. So at the end of this section, we will have a 5-minute pause where Carlos and I will be able to answer any questions. I'm going to start by explaining what emissions factors are and how we use them in NABERS Energy ratings. So when an assessor does a NABERS Energy rating, they will collect the consumption data for the building. That's the gas, the electricity, and the diesel data. I've removed the diesel from here just to help simplify things. When they enter that data into the NABERS rating system, we then apply a gas or an electricity emissions factor to that data. And that enables us to compare the different types of fuels that are being used in the building. The emissions factors that we're talking about essentially tell us how many units of emissions are released for every kilowatt hour or megajoule of energy that is consumed. And the emissions factors that we use are called NGA factors. They're National Greenhouse Accounts factors that are published by the Commonwealth Government every year. Once we do this calculation, we then make a lot of other adjustments on the data to eventually spit out a NABERS Energy rating. NABERS has been, well, when the NABERS Energy benchmarking system was developed just over 20 years ago, at the time it was the 1998 NGA factors that were available. And NABERS has continued to use those same 1998 NGA factors, and this was a conscious decision. This decision was taken for two key reasons. The first, that initially there was no real need to change those NGA factors because they were staying quite static over time. The second major reason is that by keeping the same NGA factors, building owners are able to track the performance of a building over time based on what's happening actually inside the building without having any external influences impacting the rating. Now, what we have been seeing, however, is that the electricity grid has been decarbonising, and that's because there's an increase of renewable energy in Australia. This graph from AEMO's Integrated System Plan shows the electricity emissions for the emissions linked to electricity generation over time. What you can see is over the past 15 years, the emissions for electricity have decreased, and over the next few decades, they will continue to decrease. We don't know how fast they will continue to decrease, these different lines show the different projections. We've got the slow change projection, which is the grey line, which is showing pretty much a business as usual scenario with a few of the coal-fired power plants closing down. And then you have the step change scenario where you have a really high uptake in rooftop solar and large-scale generation. So we're reaching a point where it's starting to get important to start to recognize that decarbonisation of the grid, because it is influencing how we're comparing the different fuel types that we're seeing in NABERS energy ratings. So I'm going to continue using examples of South Australia, because South Australia is a state where we have seen a fast decarbonisation of the grid, where there has been a stronger uptake of renewable energy. So I'm going to show you the 1998 NGA factors for South Australia. For gas, it was 0.21 kilograms of CO2 equivalent emissions for every kilowatt hour. And for electricity, that number was 0.95. So electricity was about 4 times higher than gas in terms of emissions. I'm now going to show you the 2019 numbers. You see the gas one is 0.22, so it's pretty much not changed. However, the electricity one has actually decreased quite a bit. It's now only 2.5 times higher than the gas one. So that's quite a bit of a significant change. And we're getting to the point where it's important for NABERS to start accurately reflecting those this new comparison between the different fuel types. And I'm going to show you an example, again in South Australia, to explain why. So here is an example of a typical 4.5-star office building in South Australia. On the left-hand side, you see a blue bar and an orange bar. And this is their building's NABERS energy rating. The blue bar is the conventional setup. Let's say this is how the building's operating today. It's the conventional setup. What we're assuming here is that it's using a gas boiler to heat the building. And it's getting just over 4 stars. Now, if that same building was to change its conventional heating system to a heat pump that's running on electricity, using the current NABERS energy rating based on 1998 emissions factors, it is going to get a slightly lower rating with the heat pump option. If we were to update the NABERS energy rating system to use the more recent emissions factors, you would see that actually the heat pump option has fewer emissions because it's using electricity, and therefore it will get a better NABERS energy rating. And this is why it's important for NABERS to start to reflect the correct emissions linked to the different fuel types. Now, this seems quite obvious in South Australia, remembering that this is an example for just one building. But in most other states, it's actually not such an obvious change. And that's because in these states, the grid has decarbonised a lot less. So here's an example of New South Wales. What you can see is that in the 1998 scenario, using the current NABERS energy rating system, what you see is that the heat pump is going to get a slightly lower rating. And still in the 2018 scenario, it's the same thing. And that's because the emissions factor for electricity has reduced a lot less in New South Wales. So we're seeing that the gap between the two technologies is reducing, but it's not to the point where the heat pump option is going to get a better rating. So you might be wondering, well, what does this actually mean for me, and will I be impacted by this change? So what it means is that in July 2021, NABERS will be updating the NGA factors used in all NABERS energy rating tools. This is going to have a small impact on ratings. Most buildings will see no change. The average types of buildings will see no change. The buildings that are going to see a slight change are the ones that are using either mostly electricity to power their buildings or are using a high proportion of gas to power their buildings. The ones that are using mostly electricity are going to see a slight improvement in their ratings, and that's because the emissions factor of electricity has decreased. There's a little bit less emissions coming from that electricity consumption. The buildings that are using a lot of gas in proportion in their whole energy mix are going to see a slight reduction in their ratings, and that's because the comparison between electricity and gas is now a little bit less favourable towards gas. And moving forwards, the grid will continue to decarbonise as we saw in those projections. And so NABERS will be reviewing the emissions factors and will be updating the NGA factors in the NABERS ratings periodically. We're not 100% sure how often yet, but will probably be in the order of every 5 years. So I'm now going to take you through some graphs to show you how much of a change there is likely to be in ratings. So I'm going back to the example, I'm doing a new example. So now this is for Victoria. So Victoria is a state where we haven't seen a huge amount of decarbonisation. So on the left, you have the buildings ratings. So this graph shows average energy ratings using the current system, which is the 1998 on the left, and with updated emissions factors on the right. What you see is the average rating will be the same. So buildings that have an average fuel mix will see that they have no change. And the reason why it's the same is because we will update the emissions factors, but then we will bring them back we'll bring all of the ratings back so that they are back at the same average. Here I'm displaying now a blue line, which is the buildings that are 100% electric. Those buildings will see a very slight improvement in their ratings. I'm now going to display two more lines. An orange one, which are the buildings that consume 40 to 50% gas in their fuel mix, and a purple line, which are the buildings that consume 60 to 80% gas in their fuel mix. What you see here is that the buildings that are 40 to 50% gas are actually quite average buildings for Victoria, and we'll see pretty much no change in their buildings on average. The buildings that are consuming more gas will see a slight decrease in their ratings.
Well, you're having that sip of water. Just a reminder to everyone that we'll have Q&A coming in a couple of minutes, so if you have your questions, shoot them away.
So that was Victoria, a state with a low amount of decarbonisation. Now moving to South Australia, the same graph. What you see is that the change will be a little bit more noticeable. The buildings that are 100% electric will get a slightly better rating. The buildings that are 40 to 50% gas will get a slightly higher decrease in their ratings. Most buildings are located between that blue line and that orange line. So most buildings will get a change that is in between those two lines. And we don't have the 60 to 80% gas users in South Australia because we don't have enough data. There are not enough buildings using that level of gas. So how can I prepare for this change? It's our objective in the next 12 months is to prepare everyone for this change and have everyone really on board and knowing what's going to happen to their ratings. So what you can do is attend a NABERS information session. We'll be having multiple information sessions, and we'll also be providing an information pack to help you understand this change, but also to help you explain this change to others. So if you're an assessor, how to explain this change to your customers, or how to explain this change to your investors. We really recommend that you let your stakeholders know early about this change. Everyone is going to need to kind of get their heads around this, tell others about this, and prepare for it. And the last thing that you can do is look at our rating prediction tool. In 6 months, in January 2021, we will have on our website a rating prediction tool that will enable you to see what that rating, or you'll be able to enter data for a rating and see what it will look like using the updated emissions factors. What you'll also be able to do is see how that building will perform predicted for 2030. So that will be using the projected emissions factors. Okay, so let's move to questions now. If there have been any questions, and I'll get Carlos to have a look at the questions if there have been any.
Yeah, Corine, so we have a few questions. I think a really interesting question and very much related to what you were saying at the end, but maybe worth talking a bit more about, is from David, who asked, how should we manage the risk that buildings may lose half a star or gain half a star when the emission factors are updated? So just to start this, one of the really important things to know is that this is a change that has been heavily supported by a really large range of NABERS users. So most building owners who are going to get a NABERS rating are already keen on us making this change. The other thing to note is that very few buildings will actually see a half-star decrease. The size of the decrease that we were showing here was more on the 0.1 to 0.2. So it's really buildings that are just on a threshold of a star rating that might lose half a star.
In terms of preparing, I think what's going to be really important is just telling people early on about this change so that they can also tell their investors, for example, if there is going to be any buildings that are going to lose half a star. It's also important to prepare people early on so that maybe they can consider focusing on that building in particular, so that they can look at what energy efficiency projects or improvements can be made for that building in particular, because they already know that, well, it may be in the case of a building that is going to lose half a star. And so the buildings that we really need to look out for are the ones that are using a high proportion of gas in their total energy mix.
Great. We're starting to get a lot of questions as well. Here's another. Emma Bird, you made a great question. We're actually going to cover some of that soon after this, so I'm going to skip it to the next session. But Matt Fitzgerald asked, the example provided so far of the forecast to NABERS ratings with updated emissions take us to 2030. What does the impact look like if the grid decarbonizes very significantly in a state in the order of 80 to 90% renewables?
So what we'll see is that the buildings using a lot of gas will get a stronger decrease in rating, but still, if you have a really steep decarbonisation, still the ratings, there will not be a massive change in ratings. You might see a half-star change, you might see a 0.6, 0.7 star change. But as you saw earlier, like, it's really hard to predict or project what's actually going to be happening, but agree that in some states we might see that happening sooner than others. And that is something that we have been looking at and we will be working on the next 12 to 18 months, is understanding what happens if we do see a state that has really fast decarbonisation. How is NABERS going to address that? How is NABERS going to address the fact that one day maybe the emissions factors will be really close to zero?
And Corine, just to complement that as well, I think the change that we're doing in 12 months, we don't have any state quite in that region just yet. So for the change that we're doing in 12 months, we're feeling very comfortable about that. And I think the fact that we're doing these cycles in probably around every 5 years, the first question would be, well, what if this happens by 2026? And I think we'll be looking in the next 12 months on how do we deal with those states. But we do have one example of this, which is in New Zealand, as well as the work we've been doing in the UK in the last 12 months. And those grids are much more decarbonized than Australia's. And using emission factors still works around the 80% to 90% emissions. So I think we have a bit of work to do there, but not work that affects what we're planning to do in 2021. And we'd love your thoughts on this. Corine, one last question before we move into the next part. It's a question from Steve. There's a lot of mention of the decarbonizing grid. What about the decarbonisation of the gas grid? Yeah.
So the gas grid shows at the moment that there is no decarbonisation of the gas grid, but we are hearing about new technology, well, other alternative fuels to the ones that we currently use in the gas grid. So we're talking about biogas, biomethane, hydrogen. At this point in time, there are no available projections. We have looked for projections to try and understand what's going to happen. There's no formally available projections that we can really rely on, but we do know that if that is something that will happen, that we can also kind of, whatever we're doing with electricity at the moment, we can apply to the gas updating the gas emissions factors as well.
Great. Thanks, Corine. I think we can move to the next part. By the way, if you have questions, put them through, because we will be answering all questions, not just the ones that we have time for now, after the conference as well.
Okay, moving on to the second update that we want to talk to you about today is carbon accounting methods. So just a bit of background on what carbon accounting is. It's basically a method that an organisation can use to measure the greenhouse gas emissions linked to the operations of the building over that past year. It's important that we follow strict methods and really robust methods when we do carbon accounting, so that everyone can be kind of very clear about what they have measured in their carbon accounting, and that they can disclose that openly, being confident that it is actually accurate and robust. And also what helps with using strict and well-recognized methods is that one carbon account in one place can be equivalent to the other carbon account in another place. Carbon accounting starts to get a little bit more messy when there is procurement of renewable energy, when there's on-site renewables. And so that's one of the key things that good carbon accounting methods look to address, to ensure that there's no double counting in the carbon accounts. And so we've been looking at the key carbon accounting protocol, which is the International Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and which released a Scope 2 guidance a few years ago. Scope 2 guidance basically means the guidance on how to count electricity emissions. And NABERS and NABERS stakeholders have been very interested in NABERS starting to follow this international protocol so that NABERS can better align and be a really robust method of measuring greenhouse gas emissions, especially in the NABERS Energy with Green Power tool, where we have procurement of renewable energy as part of the tool. So NABERS will be from July 2021 updating two key things in the NABERS Energy with Green Power tool so that we can really be following and aligning with the international best practice protocol. Those two key measures, I'm going to describe them to you now. The first is that we will be recognizing the renewable energy target in NABERS Energy with Green Power ratings. That means that a building will no longer need to buy green power for the portion of renewables in the grid from the renewable energy target. Just explain that a little bit more. In the grid, when we receive electricity from the grid, 20% of that electricity is renewable energy that's part of the renewable energy target. And every homeowner and business contributes financially to that renewable energy target. So what we're now saying is that if you are purchasing green power and want to basically be running on 100% renewable energy, you only need to be buying 80% of green power for your total consumption, because 20% of that we would already consider as renewable energy because it's from the renewable energy target. The second update that we'll be making to NABERS Energy with Green Power is how we will recognize on-site renewable energy. If there is an on-site renewable energy generation system that is large enough to be generating large-scale generation certificates, so we call these LGCs, these have to be voluntarily surrendered to be able to count towards a NABERS Energy with Green Power rating. So what that means is that if those renewable energy certificates, the LGCs, are sold, then they cannot count towards the NABERS Energy with Green Power rating. Those certificates have been sold and will be claimed by another party the renewable energy will be claimed by that party who has bought them. So the building owner has to voluntarily surrender those LGCs to be able to claim them in the NABERS Energy with Green Power rating. And just to be clear, this change is only happening in the NABERS Energy with Green Power tool. We won't be making any changes as to how renewable energy is, on-site renewables are being counted in the NABERS Energy rating system. So that's the end of that update. Hopefully that's kind of clear, but if there's anything you'd like me to clarify, please pop that in as a question. I'm now going to move on to the last section of this presentation where we're looking at everything that's still under consideration and work in progress. And as I said earlier, these things are linked to net zero. We've seen quite a significant shift towards net zero targets. Each state government has a net zero target, and many of the large property groups do as well. And what a net zero target means is that these organisations are basically committing to operating emissions-free by a certain date. The boundary of this commitment actually varies between different companies, but all of them have committed to having emissions-free energy by the end of by their target. So we've received quite a bit of interest from stakeholders about having a net zero recognition and making some additional changes to the way NABERS Energy ratings works to kind of help support them in these net zero targets. So going back to this diagram that I showed at the start with the NABERS Energy with Green Power, and the Climate Active certification. What you can see is that we've got different levels of recognition, and quite a few companies have committed to purchasing renewable energy for all of their operational energy consumption. So if we take a bit of a deeper dive into the NABERS Energy with Green Power tool, what we've been looking at over the past 12 months is whether NABERS could start to recognise renewable energy that isn't green power accredited. Currently, we only accept green power accredited renewable energy, but a lot of property groups have entered into PPAs. Well, a few property groups have entered into PPAs or are investigating them. And those PPAs are sometimes green power accredited PPAs, but are not always green power accredited PPAs. So we've been looking as to whether NABERS could start kind of broadening the renewable energy that can be considered within the NABERS Energy with Green Power tool. Now, this is something that isn't super easy for NABERS to do, because relying on green power means that we get a really robust verification and auditing process, and that green power does. So there's definitely a few challenges to this, and this is definitely something that is still work in progress and has not yet been approved or endorsed by the NABERS National Steering Committee, but it is something that we have been looking into over the past year. The second thing that we've been looking at is how NABERS can better support organisations that are going to run on 100% renewable energy. And one of those proposals that we've made and that we've had a lot of support for is opening up the 7th star of NABERS Energy with Green Power. So NABERS Energy with Green Power is currently on a 0 to 6 star scale, and when that scale was developed, it was always intended that the 7th star would be 0 emissions, so but essentially a building that's running on 100% renewables. So now we've started to have quite a bit of interest now to have some sort of recognition that would say, well, this building is actually running on 100% renewables, and the 7th star, which would be equivalent to a NABERS net zero energy emissions recognition, could be the way for a building owner to have some certified, recognized recognition for this. So we've had a lot of interest in this, both in our technical working group and within the public consultation. So definitely something that you will be hearing more about. This is the same. There's a lot of detail to work through. It maybe sounds quite straightforward, but actually it's quite a complex, and there's a few challenges that we're working through at the moment. But definitely watch this space, because this is something that we will be communicating more about. And this really kind of closes off the kind of staged approach that NABERS is looking to offer to customers, which is first looking at the NABERS energy rating and looking at the operational performance of the building, and then purchasing the renewable energy, and including recognizing buildings that are running on 100% renewables and can be considered as net zero energy emissions. And then the building can go that step further and look at those other operational emissions and get the carbon neutral certification. So that's it in terms of presentation. I've taken you through the 2 key changes that we're going to be making, and also the work that we're still working on in the Future of NABERS Energy project. These 2 areas that I've been talking to you about that are in consideration are things that we will be resolving in the next couple of months. So if you are particularly interested in these, we will be in a position to be able to say if we're going ahead with these, and if we are going ahead, how we'll be doing that. So I'm now going to open it up to the questions again. Carlos, I don't know if we've received any more questions.
Yes, we have. We have a lot of questions. A lot of them are still focusing on the first part of the presentation, which is the changes to NABERS Energy, which is understandable. And if you have questions about net zero as well, feel free to put them through, and we'll be going through them. But maybe let's just go back, and we had a really good question from Emma Bird asking, are you expecting about the changes to emission factors in NABERS? Are you expecting there to be any impacts on tenancy ratings from emission factor changes? And I would have thought that the impact would be quite limited, because tenancies, for the most part, the tenancy ratings we get are mostly electricity, unlike buildings. Yeah,
I think, that's exactly right. I think for tenancy ratings, we will see a very small impact. I just also wanted to clarify something that I mentioned earlier as well, which is those graphs that I was showing that show the impact were based on office buildings. I'm really sorry, I should have said that at the time. And what that means is that for all of the other building types, the rating systems for all the other building types were developed much later than the office buildings. And so they use emissions factors that are not as old as the emissions factors that we use in NABERS energy ratings. So those building types, shopping centres, for example, will see a smaller change in the ratings, because the difference between the current emissions factor that we're using and the updated one is going to be smaller. So any change, to get to any indication of change that you saw in those graphs, will be smaller for other building types.
We got lots more presentations. This one's coming from Brad. He says, thanks, Corine, great presentation. is there documentation of some of these proposed changes that is available that they can read?
Yeah, that's a great question. So right now on our website, if you go to the news section, you will see some different articles providing updates of everything that we're talking about today at the conference. And there is one on net zero emissions. And if you go into that article at the bottom, you will see there's a consultation paper. And that's the consultation paper that we released in May. The consultation period is now closed, but you can go and have a look. It provides a lot of background and a lot of discussion of the work that we've been doing over the past 12 months.
We have one from Jonathan Dalton, who's actually been involved in NABERS for many years up in Brisbane. And this is a question that I know we're still working on, so we don't have a definite answer for you, John. But the question is, query on NABERS Energy with green power and looking at renewables. As part of considering the purchase of renewable energy, will NABERS allow exported renewable energy from on-site to be offset against imported energy? So basically getting buildings who have on-site solar but exporting it to the grid, be able to recognize that towards their building.
I might pass this question on to you, Carlos.
Yeah, sure. I think, Jonathan, we're still working on this right now. But I can tell you a lot of the feedback we received from a lot of people in the market. Basically, the feedback we're getting is that when you sell electricity, especially, let's talk about larger solar systems, the ones above 100 kilowatt. If you're selling LGCs, according to the International Gas Protocol, that LGC, whoever you sell that power to, that is the person that can claim those renewable energies. So buildings that are doing that, I think it would be hard basically to recognize that. And we had a lot of people saying, please don't recognize that. Having said that, we're still really open to feedback on these spaces. We're doing a lot of work on what does this mean for on-site renewables as well as the purchases from the grid. So any thoughts you have on this, we'll be really interested in. Corine, we have more questions. This one's coming from Eric Moore, and we still have a few minutes if you want to keep sending questions. He says, the NABERS calculator looks to be normalized for state locations. So the average, basically, of average ratings don't change from location after this change. The average NABERS rating will be the same.
That's what we're saying.
He's asking in future updates, so the ones from 2026 and onwards, is this also expected, or would you expect to increasingly penalize gas use in buildings?
So moving forwards, we will continue to put that average back to where it was once we make the update. Does that answer the question?
I think to a point, I think what I would add maybe to that, Eric, is that we're not looking at moving entire markets. You know, we want the after making these changes, the average in a city, for example, Adelaide, to be the same before and after the change. But what will happen is that buildings that are using more decarbonized sources will probably see the ratings going up a bit, and the ones that are using more carbonized sources to go down a bit. So it's still they're still going to have an impact, but it's not going to, as a whole, as a city and across different locations. We don't want some cities going up significantly and others going down. We want that change to be done and to be fair to all locations. Now, on that topic, there was another really good question before from Eric as well on cogeneration plans, and I think it's worth talking about that before going back to the changes that we're implementing next year. He says, have buildings with cogeneration or trigeneration plans have been specifically consulted on this, and have they been targeted for additional support or communication with those assets?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we do have a lot of people on the technical working group who have cogeneration systems, and they are still supportive of this change because for all of the other buildings, they feel that it is an important change. That 60 to 80% line that you saw is probably representative of those cogeneration buildings, so they will see a decrease in ratings. So in terms of additional information, yes, like they will have access to the prediction tool, and we can, of course, I think it's probably the most important group of users to tell about this change very early so that they can know that it's coming. There is also appetite, though, from the people that sit on the technical working group, for example, for the actual kind of emissions that are linked to to cogeneration buildings to be accurately and fairly shown, and that is what we are doing by updating the emissions factors.
Yeah, and I think we also had a lot of support for the changes in the public consultation process we did about a month ago for 4 weeks. and we had a lot of support from pretty much everyone about the importance of accurately reflecting how emissions in the grid have become decarbonized, and there's a lot of benefits from that. We have a question from Anna asking, when is NABERS planning on releasing the NABERS net zero emissions recognition?
At this point in time, we still need to figure out if it is something that we will be going ahead with. So like I said, in the next couple of months, we'll be working through that. And in the next couple of months, if we do decide that this is the way, the NSC decides that this is the way we're going moving forwards, then we'll be able to announce when we'd make that change. It could be, for example, at the same time as we make the other changes. So it could be in July 2021, or we might need a bit more time to prepare everyone and to make the necessary changes that we need to make to the NABERS ratings and the rules, etc., for that. So at this point in time, we can't say.
We're moving as fast as we can, but obviously the consultation process is a really important part of designing a new product. So if you have any thoughts on this, we'd love to work with you. So please feel free to reach out. We have time for maybe one, maybe two more questions. We have one from Matt saying the ACT is purchasing 100% renewable energy for the whole state or the whole territory, which is actually not recognized in the NGA factors currently, the formal official emission factors in Australia. Are there plans to recognize this for the ACT in future emission factors updates?
So my understanding is that renewable energy certificates are not counted in NGA factors. So moving forwards, I don't think that they will be counted. The other challenge, well, okay, that's the first thing. The second thing is that we are looking to count this renewable energy purchasing from the ACT in our NABERS Energy with Green Power tool. So it would be counted as a renewable energy purchase. What we need to clarify right now, though, is that commitment from the ACT green power, because at the moment NABERS only recognises green power. Moving forwards, if NABERS opens up and recognises other things than green power, then no matter if it is green power or not, we'll be able to recognise it. So there's a few things that we need to work through to kind of get confirmation about this on a yearly basis and know if it's green power or not, and if it's been kind of really surrendered through the green power product. And if it is, then we can start to consider that for all the ACT buildings. That means that all the ACT buildings would get a 6-star NABERS Energy with Green Power rating.
Yeah, and I think the one thing I would add to that, and that was unfortunately the last question because we're going to have to go into a break in a few seconds. But the importance of the NGA factors are the official carbon accounting in Australia, and that's the reason why we use them as a program. But we don't actually manage those emission factors. They're managed by our colleagues in the Commonwealth. And I know that the ACT government is very interested in working on that issue with the Commonwealth, and they're having active discussions about that. So we'll see how those discussions progress, and whatever outcome that comes into the emission factors in the future, we'll be working to align as much as we can with that. I think that's all the time we have for this session. And I know that this stream in particular has some really, really big topics that a lot of people are very interested about, as we found out in the last 12 months working with a lot of industry stakeholders. So if you have any thoughts or ideas or comments or opportunities that you see out of this work, feel free to get in touch with us. We'd love to work with you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think any questions that you do have will help inform us on what we need to provide in the information sessions and the information pack that we'll be providing. So yeah, please don't hesitate to send through your thoughts and comments and questions.